are listening to the SecureWorld Sessions, a cybersecurity podcast that gives you access.
Access granted.
Access to people and ideas that inspire and inform. Hello and welcome to episode 54. This is Bruce Sussman, Director of Content at SecureWorld and your podcast host. And it's great to have you with us. Thanks for making it, a successful first year of the podcast. And now we're headed into year 2. So that is great. I'm really excited about today's topic because we are talking about cloud's biggest year and the future of cloud and how does security play such a key part of that. We're going to be interviewing a cloud optimist today, Mark Nunnikhoven, who is Vice President of Cloud Research at Trend Micro. And first of all, I want to say thanks to Trend Micro for being our premier podcast partner, but most importantly, for allowing us to pick Mark's brain on such a crucial topic that he focuses on every single day. So we will talk about cloud's future, making cloud security usable and stable, opportunities and the challenges around cloud security. And how about DevSecOps? What does building in this environment look like now, or how should it look? And then we're talking about integrated versus external or additional cloud security tools. So a wide-ranging topic. And you'll notice that when I ask the questions, I won't sound quite the same. I did this interview on the road, away from our SecureWorld podcast studio, so the audio is not quite as good. But here's the nice thing. Mark's audio is outstanding. He does most of the talking anyway. So with that, let's get started with my interview and welcome our guest. So my guest today on the podcast is Mark Nunnikhoven, Vice President of Cloud Research at Trend Micro. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for being on the podcast today. And I was thinking about your title here, Vice President of Cloud Research. And I'm going to try not to make a joke saying, your head's always in the cloud or something like that, because I'm sure that's probably an ongoing theme, right? When you tell people that. But what does that mean? What are you actually up to and working on?
It's not that far off of a description, actually, which lines up well. I've got this really wonderful role, at least it really suits me well, where my job is to look at how people are using the cloud, how that's changing modern IT, and where things are going in sort of the 3 to 5 year timeline range. And I do that, of course, with a security and a privacy lens, given that I work for a cybersecurity company in Trend Micro. So it's a fascinating role that I kind of just do let to get my head in the clouds and explore what's going on and see the different possibilities and how that lines up with the reality of IT, which is always where things get a little stormy.
Yes, very good. I love the way you worked in those weather analogies in cloud. Nicely done.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about 2020. We know this was a huge year for cloud. Do you think it's safe to say it was cloud's biggest year ever?
Yeah, if you want to talk about storms, 2020 is the mother of all storms, and it's still going on. But there has been a bright spot in the IT world, and that is sort of the move or the acceleration of the existing trend of people moving into the cloud. And when I say cloud, the challenge we have is everyone thinks something different, and the answer is cloud encompasses all of that. So whether you're just thinking of using something like Office 365 or G Suite, or if you're thinking about the service that backs up your phone, or if you're building in AWS and Google or Azure, all of these things have seen a huge acceleration this year as the physical component has been restricted from us, due to the pandemic. And I think it's very interesting because there was nothing holding us back before other than just a familiarity or a comfort for it. So the forcing of saying, we can't all physically be in the same place, so we need to look at new IT solutions. That sort of started the ball rolling where people were saying, well, we're already exploring about this cloud thing. Let's kick that into high gear and see what we can do.
Yeah, that's interesting. And actually, it's funny to hear you talk about, things from kind of a rosy scenario that we had to make this change and it worked pretty well. I mean, I know that some of my colleagues and I were joking part of the time, like if one more person, starts a Zoom meeting, at noon Eastern, the whole cloud could come crashing down, but it never happened. It seems like, I mean, do you feel like it was a pretty solid kind of, I don't know, benchmarking on cloud that it could sure scale up in a hurry?
Yeah. And, I mean, obviously results are going to vary depending on the service that people picked and the team that set things up. So you do hear those sort of horror stories from smaller companies that said, we tried this and it all fell over. But in general, if you're talking about sort of the state of cloud, focusing on the big three providers with AWS, Microsoft's Azure, and a Google Cloud Platform, which most of the other services we associate as cloud run on, it's been a wild success. Now, that's due to billions and billions of dollars of continuing investment by those three companies. But I think for the rest of us who aren't at those three, the advantage is, we're not worrying about a whole layer that we did before that took up a ton of our time and effort that really didn't gain us any advantage. It was work we had to do to get to the work that we had to do. And now that the big three are doing that, and obviously, with this road test, with this trial by fire, they're doing it at a world-class level. And it's nice that we don't have to worry about it. It is really kind of put to bed those concerns of like, oh, it could never meet my demands. Well, yeah, the cloud can, and it has.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're right. That's trial by fire. And sometimes that's how we learn best. I mean, we had no choice and it worked wonderfully overall. Now, I do want to know from your viewpoint, as you continue to do your research, do you think there's any going back as like we've surged into the cloud, but then things pull back? Or do we keep moving that direction? I mean, is this I don't want to call it a permanent shift because nothing's forever, but you know what I mean? Is it sort of a permanent shift?
Yeah, it's permanent till the next permanent one comes along.
There you go.
And I think, if we look at this two ways, from an infrastructure perspective, that is accelerating and going to continue to accelerate, where people who used to buy servers and rent space in data centers are very much realizing that they can do that more effectively in the cloud. And it's not necessarily that their spend is going to go down, but they're going to get more value for money, which I think is a really a better way to look at it. And for the broader sense of cloud, so those tools that are always constantly connected to a back end, a lot of, for those of us who switched to working from home who weren't previously, that's a lot of the collaboration tools. I think there's a really good chance that they stay in high levels of usage. But the challenge we have around that, like most technology, ends up being the people, where if everybody is, why working from home has been so successful is because everybody is doing it within a company typically right now, which means all of your normal workflows for communicating, for getting together, for sharing ideas, everything had to shift. Whereas companies that were really hesitant on leveraging those tools before normally had a hybrid model where they were having some people in the office still collaborating, on whiteboards and talking to each other and sort of existing patterns and trying to incorporate remote people. So there's a risk that rolls back a bit when people go into the office. But I think by and large, most companies and most organizations have realized the advantages of, not having to fight through traffic, being able to actually have a reference of what has been decided and what's been worked on. People are seeing a lot of upside to these type of tooling. So I think it's safe to say it's here to stay for now.
Okay, I like that until whatever the next permanent comes along. That's a great viewpoint. Okay, excellent. I want to move on a little bit and let's talk more about securing what an organization is doing in and through the cloud. And I hope you don't mind. I was cyber stalking you before our interview here today, and maybe I shouldn't admit that. Are we recording? Yes, we are. Oh, I'm in trouble. I was on your LinkedIn page and you said cloud security must be both usable and stable. What can you unpack that for us?
Yeah. And, and it's okay, cyber stalking. That's what LinkedIn is up there for.
There you go.
And I think it's, so I've been in security for a long time, like over 25 years, practicing in cybersecurity and information security. And one of the things I think, it's fair to say, and, full caveat, I say this as a practitioner in the field, is that we've gotten away with a lot of stuff for a long time in security. And by that, I mean, imposing controls and systems on people, big quotes for their own good in order to secure things that weren't usable, that weren't functional, that made people change how they work and jump through a lot of hoops. And we've had okay-ish success, and that's my optimistic phrasing of cybersecurity success overall. But what I firmly believe and what people are seeing more and more is that if you take a more modernized approach to security, a more integrated approach that partially is enabled by the shift into the cloud, you can have security that people don't object to. They're not like, oh, I have to do this again. They don't try to work around it just to get the job done because it's always getting in their way. So that's that usable piece. And then that stable piece is it needs to be predictable. It needs to be consistent. So easy, relatable example for people is how smooth the flow for multi-factor authentication has become for a lot of sites. So that's when you use your username and your password, and then either something that was texted to you, a one-time code, or an app on your phone. And sure, it's an extra step, but it's a pretty smooth step by now. Most people, are comfortable with it. It doesn't take that much longer to log in. But that significantly reduces the chances of your account being compromised. And that's a huge security win for a minor usability cost. And that's, I think, how we need to view security is in terms of what's the cost versus the benefit, whereas we've been able to sort of spend as much as we want as defenders for a long time. And I think we can do better.
Yeah, that cost versus benefit analysis, including, when we implement a control, what our end users or customers going to experience. That's a great way of putting it. Fantastic. Okay, so thanks for unpacking that. Let's move into some of the opportunities and challenges around security in the cloud. And maybe we start with some of the challenges first. What are you seeing in this space where organizations are, coming up against some things that they would like to work through?
Yeah, I think the two biggest challenges when it comes to security in the cloud really come down to keeping up. There is an insane amount of innovation happening in the cloud. All of the big three and a lot of cloud services have shifted to this model where what they deliver to us as customers is essentially an organic living thing. It's constantly changing. There's always new features and functionality and services launching. So keeping up with that to understand what your options are and how best to leverage that is quite tricky. And then understanding your organization and how you're leveraging cloud. So getting that visibility and getting a handle on how your company wants to take advantage of these tools, because that requires a change in fundamentally in how we do security. We used to basically try to put everything in a box because we knew if we held on to that box, we're good, right? I can protect this box. I know who's coming in and out of this box, as a metaphor, and, literally with servers as boxes in our data centers. And that's totally changed with the cloud, where you're now connecting to a dozen different services in the back end that are hosted by different people that have different types of data being processed in them. And so that needs a mind shift. And that can be really, really tricky, especially for security teams that are swamped firefighting, incidents and trying to keep things relatively stable in the environment they know. So there's a big educational challenge and sort of getting them enough breathing time to get their head above water to see this new opportunity, because I think if they embrace it, we can get a lot better security. But I think those are that pace of innovation and that challenge in shifting your mindset is really the two biggest things facing security as far as a challenge goes.
Okay, excellent. All right, so that's the challenges side of the equation. Let's go to the other side now and talk about opportunities around security in the cloud. What do you see as opportunities right now?
I think it is the opportunities far outweigh the challenges because there is, just like in infrastructure, there's a ton of stuff in security that we've been doing that we don't have to do. So I spent a number of years helping build up network security teams and SOC teams. And, the amount of log lines that you chew through in a day to try to find a viable event that could be an incident, it was just a lot of menial work. And now we're getting much better tooling. But a lot of that infrastructure being pushed off to the cloud providers and in that shared responsibility model means that's less you need to be having your eye on constantly because you're trusting your cloud provider to do that. And I say trust fully knowing that that's really hard for security people to do, but that's why we have compliance frameworks and validations on the providers. But because as a business, you're responsible for less of the lower infrastructure, that lets you focus your security efforts where they can really drive value. So, you do not gain any business benefit by defending Windows better. That's just a cost of doing business. But if you could get rid of that by not leveraging services in the cloud that provide an operating system to you, and they're your cloud provider's responsibility, that means you can take those same security resources and focus on the business data flowing through the application or the custom code that you're writing. So it's really, the cloud is providing that opportunity for you to up-level your security game, so that you can focus on where you provide unique value as a security team, because you're doing less under that security shared responsibility model. And I think that that's critical. And that opens up a world of opportunity around automation, around usable security, and helping your business move forward instead of being that roadblock all the time.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you bring that up. I was thinking about one of the speakers we had at SecureWorld Boston earlier this year, which of course was virtual since it's 2020, but that was basically the title of her talk. She was from Harvard University, from their security team, and it was something around, get on board with digital transformation or get left behind. That's kind of where security is, and you don't want to be that roadblock anymore. So that's fantastic. I do want to ask you about how remote work is changing the way teams build in this environment and how it's impacting DevSecOps. What are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting shift. So one of the things I like about the shift to remote work that's kind of rattling some cages in the security world is it's bringing us back away from cybersecurity back to information security. And over the last 10 years, I'd say, we've almost shifted exclusively to using the term cybersecurity as opposed to information security. And it sounds like splitting hairs, but cybersecurity is protecting the digital assets like the servers, the systems, the applications, where information security is worrying about the data, right? And when you work from home, now you've got this challenge of, okay, I have these digital systems that people are accessing, but they still could be printing stuff out. They're in different physical spaces. There's just an expanse because you've gone, far more distributed. And I think that's a positive thing for the business overall. But that is a shift in mindset again, where you're thinking about work. And when we look at that extending into how you're building IT solutions, the good news here is that a lot of the tools that you're using, if you're practicing a DevOps philosophy in your engineering teams, a lot of these tools were already digital anyway. Maybe you got around a whiteboard and worked some stuff out, but that's a pretty easy switch into some virtual meetings or leveraging Slack or something similar. So now, we're getting into this shift where you're distributed, but you're not really losing much because, when you're building, you're very much, the code is that source of truth. It's the one thing that it makes it easy to communicate. And we were never good at communicating this verbally anyway. So it's very simple to shift to that, to remote working. But I like that in general, even outside of that remote work shift, that switch to a DevOps philosophy. I know it makes a lot of people on the security side uncomfortable, but I love that push because it really, what it means, outside of all the standard benefits that are touted, what it really means is your organization is making smaller changes more often, but those smaller changes means less risk. And it's easier to identify when things go wrong, and it's easier to manage that risk. So there's a huge security upside to shifting this. And, thankfully, it hasn't really been impacted by this big push to work from home.
It's interesting as I hear you go through all of the different things that you've touched on today, how things shift and change constantly. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, and this is just a side note here, but wouldn't you say if you're in security, you should get comfortable with change?
Absolutely. And I would say, I would expand that to say, not just the change we're used to, security teams in general, or at least successful security teams, have a really good ability to keep up to date on the latest, 0 days, on the latest attack techniques. In our niche, we are very good at assimilating new information and putting it into practice. I think the problem is we also get sort of the horse blinders on. And if we expand out and realize that's not just us anymore, the entire business, especially the IT delivery side, is saying, hey, there's all this new stuff that can make us better. We need to get out of our own little clubhouse and start to talk to the rest of the business and expand our comfort level with what they're doing as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's very crucial. And I've certainly been hearing that theme from the security leaders that I talk to. So I'm glad you brought that up, Mark. Okay, let's talk about security built into the cloud. And as you know, all the major players are constantly touting and talking about the security features that are integrated into the platform. And I'm going to ask you a question that I love to ask because I love to see what everyone's opinion is on. Is this enough? I mean, have we solved the security issues in the cloud by simply using the tools that these cloud providers provide?
Yeah, I think solved is an interesting word. I firmly believe that you can have far better security in the cloud than you could on your own. And the reason for that comes down to that shared responsibility model, which is essentially, if you start at something like a virtual machine or an instance, you take over at the operating system. Everything below that, the networking structure, the physical box, the power, the cooling, all that kind of stuff's taken care of by the cloud provider. So you only have to secure the OS and the stack on top of that. So the apps in your data. And of course, the service providers give you features, sort of knobs and levers to configure that service. And the more your business sort of gets into the cloud, I see this pattern time and time again where they go, well, wait a minute, if we don't need to manage these boxes, what else don't we need to do? So maybe you move away from servers and instances into containers. And maybe you realize, well, that's even heavy for what we want. So we start to leverage serverless designs and more managed services. And you go, well, this is great. We're doing less and less. And the trade of the security shift there is that your cloud provider is doing more and more. The good news is they've got a great track record of doing this at world-class levels. If you dig into all of the security incidents around cloud, and I have, that's part of my role, almost none of them are actually the cloud provider being breached or having an issue. There are some occasions where an outage or a slow patch application, but those were in the early days of the cloud providers getting up to speed. Nothing's happened in recent memory, which is great. All of the breaches and issues have been around understanding the shared responsibility model, have been understanding how you're configuring things. And now I always have this debate and challenge with my security teammates and colleagues when they're like, we need to worry about hackers, we need to worry about cyber criminals. And yes, you do. But when it comes to cloud, the number one issue is mistakes and misconfigurations. Because these developers who are building, people who are leveraging the power of the cloud, you can literally stand up an entire data center with one script, one command, and you've got the equivalent of an entire data center up and running. And that's amazing. That's a wonderful tool for the business. But think about all those assets that you need to understand how to secure, how to protect, how to configure properly. And that's why we keep seeing these mistakes. So if you understand that model, if you understand how to configure those services so that they are strong and you're controlling permissions and access, you can have way better security at the same level of effort or less in the cloud. Now, if you don't understand what you're doing, you would obviously expose yourself more significantly than you would be in an on-premise center because you've got a whole bunch of safeguards that you control, but that normally takes a lot more resources. So I think there's way more upside. It's just a question of education, keeping up to speed, and then leveraging things like automated tools to make sure that you're not making the same mistakes over and over again.
It's a really interesting point when you talk about how easy it is to stand up a cloud environment. And I want to pick your brain on this because this is something that I've heard leaders say is one of the challenges is, let's say at a medium-sized organization, you might say this person is responsible for standing up the cloud environment. And while they might have expertise in one area of the cloud environment, they may not have expertise in understanding the security tools or even sometimes the security considerations around certain things. And that is what ends up leading to misconfigurations or just boxes not being set, et cetera, or tools not being implemented. Does that ring true with you or something like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So one of the, I think the easiest example to understand, and one of the things that just always gets me kind of going is the storage issue. So we'll use Amazon S3 simply because it's the most popular of these type of services, but basically just a simple storage system in the cloud. And Amazon S3 buckets start life completely locked down. The only person or object that can write into those buckets or read from those buckets is the one that created it. So every other, every breach you've seen associated to them, and it's been billions of records over the last couple years, has been somebody has accidentally assigned too permissive a policy to that storage bucket, right? And that's a simple mistake, and it happens, and it's happened, exposing over billions of records. But that is exactly what that scenario that you just described, where somebody doesn't quite understand, especially permissions can be tricky, even though they've been greatly simplified in the cloud. So here's something that by default is completely locked down, that somebody has opened up to, more often than not, solve a problem. When you're trying to build something, you're like, well, we'll just give it more permissions, and now it works, and we're great, and they never lock them down again. And that's an educational challenge. I think that's also a big cultural challenge. For the longest time, security teams haven't been great at working with other teams. Part of that comes down to that constant firefighting. Part of it is just, we're very myopically focused on threats. But the reality is, in small business and medium business, in larger enterprises, you tend to talk to the security team at the kickoff of a project and at the end of it. And that's not good enough. We need to be educating everybody so that they can make better decisions throughout. And especially for smaller businesses, the smart defaults that the cloud providers have taken is a great start. But again, that shared responsibility model means that if you want to open everything up to the world, you can, but it's up to you to understand the consequences of that. So I think, more education is required, more public education and raising awareness around the issues. But again, I think, as much as that's a challenge, the upside is still outweighing the downside here, because businesses are being able to deliver more value for the same or less resource cost, which is a huge win.
And I thought this might be a good time too to ask you just briefly for our audience, as far as utilizing the cloud at Trend Micro or utilizing it to improve security, what do you guys have going over there?
Yeah, so from a security point at Trend Micro, we are our cloud point. We are both a large cloud consumer. We leverage the cloud heavily internally as a larger enterprise would, as well as in products and services that we deliver to our customers. And those products and services help our customers to secure their cloud environments and what they're building in the cloud. So we've got a platform called Trend Micro Cloud One that is targeted at people who are building IT solutions in the cloud, whether that's in AWS, in Azure, or in Google Cloud Platform. And the idea there is to provide a set of services that will help you fulfill your responsibilities in the shared responsibility model. And a lot of that time, that starts with an offering called Conformity. That is simply pointed at your account, and then it'll start popping up with ideas based on security checks saying, hey, you might want to turn this feature on in AWS or this feature on in Azure. Here's why, here's what it'll do for you. So I love that product simply because it falls along that educational model of, hey, Bruce, you turned this on. Here's the impact of that. And if you want that, great. If not, here's how you turn that back off. And we'll alert you if anyone happens to turn that back on again. So I like a security control like that because it's not just going to stop something, but it's also going to provide that educational piece in the context, right? So it helps, like your question earlier about, how do smaller businesses get a hold of that? Well, having a tool like Conformity in place helps you sort of have that security expert at your beck and call that's automatically checking your work as you go. And that's seen a lot of success with customers. And more importantly, I think it sets customers up for future success in whatever they're building. And that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. And I'd never heard of Conformity before you mentioned it just now, but that absolutely answers what we were talking about earlier. That's incredible that you guys have that. Okay, great. Thanks for that overview. And now to my last question for you. I get the sense from talking to you that you're a cloud optimist. Is that true?
Yeah, I think the current format of my optimism is definitely around cloud and promoting its use. But I think one of the things that I really am fascinated with and always have been is sort of looking at patterns. Like I said, I've been in security a long time. My training, and I spent a number of years as a forensic investigator because I love diving into patterns and seeing what's going on. And now what I'm doing is sort of looking at bigger patterns as opposed to trying to dissect what happened on one particular machine. And I think what cloud is really enabling is us to correct some of the things that built up over the last 40 years of IT and the 40 years of security. And to realize that, we do a phenomenal amount of work to get to the point to do the work that we actually wanted to do in the first place. And the cloud lets us get rid of that and dive in and start, digging into the problem. And, I'm still writing code daily. And I love when I can just dive in and actually write code to solve my problem, as opposed to a whole bunch of management framework and structure to get to that point. So I'm absolutely an optimist, simply because we now have all of this possibility, and we have access to services that we never would have been able to before. So there's a great suite suite from all the cloud providers around machine learning. It's as simple as one, for a service like image recognition style services, you send an image to it with one call and it spits back what's in that image file, which is something that would have taken an insane amount of work even 5 years ago. So that kind of possibility, I think, is great. Tie that in with being able to do it safely and more securely than ever. I'm absolutely an unabashed cloud optimist just because of the results you can get from leveraging that suite of technologies.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, Mark Nunnikhoven, Vice President of Cloud Research at Trend Micro, thanks so much for spending time with us today and sharing your insights. And, I hope that your optimism is well placed because the cloud, as you say, is here to stay until something else comes along, and that's going to be a while. So we need it. So thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that was a fantastic interview and really appreciate Mark being here. Now, one of the things that he mentioned was Trend Micro's Cloud One. And I don't know if you are familiar with this platform or not. He touched on some of these things, but this is it's fantastic because it's some of the broadest and deepest cloud security solution platforms you'll find, from cloud migration projects to cloud native application delivery, or maybe you're working on cloud center of excellence driven objectives. You'll find that Trend Micro's Cloud One is automated, flexible, and it's really all in one security. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Also, Trend Micro has created a fantastic cloud migration paper that really gives you some best practices you want to shoot for, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Thanks again for being a member of our growing podcast audience. Really appreciate you and for your feedback and the topic suggestions you've been sending in to media@secureworldexpo.com. And remember, we've got, constant stream of news at our website, secureworldexpo.com, and also a regular dose of web conferences and virtual conferences across North America to kind of help bring the security community together wherever and however we can. On behalf of the entire Secure World team, thanks so much for being here. I'm Bruce Sussman, your host, and we'll catch you again